report today. Thank you, press, for coming over. We wanted to speak to you for about 15 minutes on SB 559, which is the Fair and Impartial Policing Act. As you know, the DOJ released its report in part finding that disparate impact on African Americans is caused by racially biased policing. A couple of the main stats that they released were that African Americans are 1.34 times more likely to be stopped in their vehicles and 2.07 times more likely to have their vehicles searched, but are 26% less likely to be found with contraband than white people. African Americans are twice as likely to receive a citation and 2.37 times more likely to be arrested following a vehicular stop. Although police departments in Missouri are not required to document pedestrian stops, the report also notes that the Ferguson Police Department conducted 31 pedestrian stops and 30 of them were for African American people. These stats are not Ferguson specific. While the report focuses on Ferguson, the factors that they use to determine that racial bias exists in Ferguson policing could be found pretty much anywhere in Missouri. Those factors, including a history of racism in Ferguson, exist in Missouri. Missouri has a history of racism. Ferguson was a sundown town, which means that black folks were not allowed in Ferguson after dark, and many other municipalities, towns, and cities in St. Louis were also sundown towns. That's not specific to Ferguson, and that racism still exists in many other places. They also talked about the consistency and magnitude of racial disparities in policing. That is something that has been found for 10 years in a row through statistics gathered by, or demographics gathered by police officers and reported by the Attorney General. And that doesn't even include, those racial disparities don't even include pedestrian stops, it's just traffic stops. Another factor that they talked about is a failure in leadership and the failure of decision makers to evaluate and address the race-based impact of policing practices. And that's something that also exists in Missouri, that does not just exist in Ferguson. We can blame officials in Ferguson all we want, but the state of Missouri has also been lackluster, and not only their analysis of racially biased policing in Missouri, but also in their response to it. 10 years of evidence of racial disparity in policing, and nothing has happened with it. No other bill has been passed, no other rules have been passed, and nothing else has been asked of police officers other than just to report those and go about business as usual. I would like to say a little bit about the Fair and Impartial Policing Act itself. There are many provisions in the Fair and Impartial Policing Act, SB 559, that will address many of these concerns that came out of the Ferguson report that also apply to the state of Missouri at large. There would actually be a prohibition against biased policing under state law. It would expand data collection and reporting on demographics to not just traffic stops, but pedestrian stops as well, which is one of the main issues that people experience in Ferguson, being stopped on the street for no other reason than that they're black. It would require expanded Attorney General analysis of the reported information. It would require training for law enforcement on fair and impartial policing. It would create a tiered review process for department compliance, create community police partnerships, so that which is another issue addressed by the DOJ report, that the communities don't trust their police officers anymore, and those community police partnerships would help build that trust. It would also address law enforcement policies and procedures surrounding searches, stops, and seizures, create a grievance process for members of the public who allege they were victims of biased policing, and tie departmental funding to compliance with this act, which is the enforcement mechanism that currently does not exist in Missouri law and probably doesn't exist in most municipalities, towns, and cities in Missouri. With that being said, the ACLU is not working on this bill by ourselves. We are working in partnership with the Don't Shoot Coalition out of St. Louis. They've been doing amazing work. We're honored to work with them. That being said, Michael McPherson is here with his co-chair Denise Lieberman of the Don't Shoot Coalition, so I'd like to invite Michael up to say a few words as well.
Hello everybody, thank you for being here today, and thank you for being here today. So my name is Michael McPherson. I'm Executive Director of Veterans for Peace and co-chair of the Don't Shoot Coalition, and this is my co-chair, Denise Lieberman. I'm speaking in this press conference today in support of SB 559 and the Fair and Impartial Policing Act. I want to thank Senator Maria Chappelle-Nadal for your efforts in introducing the bill, and also the co-sponsors. We all want to live in prosperous and safe communities. For a community to have prosperity and safety, it must at least have these four things. There's other things too, but these are the four that I'm going to talk about real quickly. Adequate and affordable housing, quality and accessible education, good paying jobs, and trust between the police, the people of the community and its police. Unfortunately, in far too many communities across Missouri, there is mistrust between a significant number of people and law enforcement. And while it is true all the answers to the changes we face are not found in the State House, legislative reforms can go a long way in building a framework for building trust. While reviewing specific incidents in the Department of Justice report on Ferguson, of course we're enraged. For many of us, the results of the report came to us as no surprise. I have worked on police accountability since 1997 in St. Louis and around the nation. I have heard many stories of police abuse and misconduct. I have seen and felt the pain of parents who have lost their children to police violence. And as a member of Veterans for Peace, I've also seen the pain of parents who have lost their children to war, both so-called enemy and soldiers. And I'm going to tell you something, that pain's the same. I don't care why people lose their children to violence, it's the same kind of pain. Ferguson is not an isolated case. There are far too many stories and incidents throughout the region and country. We have a crisis of confidence in the police that must be addressed. Ferguson made many aware who did not know or could not see that this distrust is simmering below the surface. We now have a movement across the country. Missouri has opportunity to lead the country in police reform and healing. The eyes of the world have been on us for months. We must not waste this opportunity. I care about Missouri, and I want all of us to live in safe and prosperous communities. To do so, we must work together to find answers that will rebuild trust. This bill and others before the legislators is the beginning of this process. And then one last thing, just now, we talked a little bit about racism and how racism of the past is affecting what's happening right now. So really, one of the things we have to understand is that we have to deal with the legacy of racism. And so we have to deal with that legacy within the framework of the laws, but we also have to deal with that racism within the framework of how we socialize and relate to each other as people. So this bill will help us in the framework of laws, which is very, very important. And then that will help also in how we relate to each other as people and individuals. So, thank you.
So, in getting this bill through the legislature, obviously we put a lot of thought and debate into who would be a good sponsor for this bill, who's a strong voice, who can represent the communities that are affected and speak to their plight forcefully and thoughtfully. And I would like to ask Senator Maria Chappelle-Nadell to step up and speak a little bit about the bill, why she's sponsoring it, and also express our gratitude, and I'm sure the gratitude of many people affected by these policies, for agreeing to sponsor this bill. It's a huge deal to have it sponsored. It'll be a huge deal to have it heard, and if it gets passed, I'll dance in the street, probably along with a lot of other people. So, Maria Chappelle-Nadell.
We'll all be dancing in the street.
And we won't get stopped for doing it.
That's even better. So first of all, I would like to thank members of the ACLU, the Don't Shoot Coalition, as well as the other organizations that represent the movement behind this piece of legislation. I was really pleased to be asked to even file this legislation. And a lot of these things I have been thinking about in some way. I have addressed in other pieces of legislation. I will tell you that when I was a little girl, until Ferguson happened, I never thought about something my mom used to always say. She taught criminal justice for years at the community colleges at Forest Park. And one thing I remember she said in her classrooms that the most difficult students she ever had were police officers. And so I thought that was fascinating, but I had not thought about that in like 30 years. But obviously that gets to the point of one of the provisions of the bill is proper training, cultural competency. What we have found since day one, there are many officers who did not recognize the different cultural habits of minority communities and how people respond in certain situations. When I visualize what has happened to many of my constituents and myself and the people who are behind me, including Mustafa, who I just love to death. I just love you, Mustafa. But it's important that we have some commonalities, that we have certain principles that are put in place, an agreement on how we are going to engage in the future. Yes, it is true. In 1999 or 2000, there was legislation that passed that dealt with capturing the number of stops per municipality, but it's limited in the sense that we're also not capturing the number of people who are stopped while walking. I did not personally know that the percentages of people being stopped, African Americans being stopped, was so high. I did not know that. And while there's some things in the report, the DOJ report, were not surprising, there were some issues that were surprising. For the example is 14 bites, all African American. How could an officer allow an individual to be bitten by dogs? That was just appalling. The jokes that went back and forth using taxpayer dollars, that was appalling. Everyone should know that's not something that you do. But what I am also happy about, and my cousin and I were talking about this earlier, is tying departmental funding to compliance with this act. There are several, I don't know if y'all know this or not, but I was reminded this morning with my cousin who works for DED, but apparently from the early 1990s, there is a provision in place that says to certain entities, public entities, if you are receiving federal dollars, you cannot harm protesters. It comes from an anti-abortion issue that happened in the early 1990s. So as people were going to Planned Parenthood and such, those protesters were upset that they were being prevented from protesting. Well, because that provision still applies in federal law, that means that any federal money that's going through the state and going through municipalities will be prevented from receiving those federal dollars. Now, that has nothing to do with this bill, but what I'm saying is there is a movement. For the people behind me and the people they represent on the streets, the people that I represent every day, it is going to take systematic change so that my constituents and others that come after us do not have to deal with discrimination whatsoever. They should be able to be protected under the law. And you do not have a right, a police officer does not have a right to pick and choose who is covered under the law. Obviously, the case that I love the most is Mustafa versus County of St. Louis, which talks about the arbitrary rules that were created to limit the voice of individuals. And while this Senate bill helps to train police officers in cultural competency, it also allows them to have an infrastructure in place so these types of things, the taking away of our rights, our constitutional, our civil, and our human rights does not occur and is not repeated. This is a devastating point in Missouri history and in our country's history, and right now we are the embarrassment of the country as people are making policies and are interacting with similar situations. Everyone is learning from the Ferguson experience, and they always say, let's not do what they did in Ferguson. This is a first step. Senate Bill 559 is a first step so that we have a better system that is in place where people are not deprived of their rights.
We have a couple minutes for questions if anybody from the press has them, either for myself or Michael or the senator. So just let us know if you do. Otherwise, we'll wrap up.
I had a question for you, Michael.
Sure.
I'm David Lieb with the Associated Press.
Hi, David.
So you talked about the crisis in confidence in the police.
Yeah.
I'm wondering your thoughts on what has happened since the report came out. For example, the city manager is gone, the city clerk is gone, the municipal judge is gone in Ferguson. From your perspective, does that help address the situation, or is there more that needs to happen? Do you want to see the police chief, the mayor, the city council members go? Tell me what you would like to see occur there.
Well, so let me say first, I don't live in Ferguson.
Yeah.
So the people of Ferguson are going to have to make decisions about things when it comes to elected officials. But if I did live in Ferguson, certainly I would want the mayor to be gone and the police chief, no doubt whatsoever. Yeah, I think the fact that some of these people have resigned out of embarrassment is good, but unfortunately they weren't forced out officially. There wasn't a framework that took them out. So that means that if something similar happens, that people could still stay in office because there's not a process to get rid of people when they do something that is really against the community. And I think the most important thing, I think over the years that I've seen this, and I'm going to speak specifically from when Amadou Diallo was shot. He was shot at 41 times and hit 11 times in New York City. The thing that bothers me the most, and I think when I talk to young people the most, is that police are not held accountable. So until we see individual police officers held accountable for their actions, I think that's where you'll get the most out of rebuilding trust. That is the highest standard, I believe, anyway, for where you get the trust. But I think these things that we're doing is starting to build a foundation, and starting to build a foundation. But there's a lot more that has to be done.
And so when you talk about wanting to see the mayor and police chief be replaced, are you speaking from your own personal opinion, or is that the position of the Don't Shoot Coalition?
That's my personal opinion, because we haven't developed a position as a coalition. And I'm sure one of the reasons is because most of us don't live in Ferguson. We don't want to be trying to tell people Ferguson what they should do, But we will talk more about that as this process moves forward.
So you're a resident of where?
St. Louis.
City itself?
Yes.
Okay.
So if the same thing happened in St. Louis, I would want Mayor Slay to go, for sure. Sometimes
well, it did happen in St. Louis.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And it happened,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it happened right during, when that video came out. There's a current lawsuit the last 6 or 8 weeks that was announced. There was a video shortly after Ferguson occurred of a person under arrest and then beaten by police officers, and then they did like a code red, which meant we're still being videotaped. That came out like 2 weeks ago, something like that. And so the police department said they did not want to have, it was in your paper, the police department said they did not want to have that video released because they were in fear that the craziness would expand to St. Louis City. So it has happened in St. Louis City. It has happened.
Senator Spilda, I'd have a question for you. Have you floated any of these ideas to law enforcement people, and have you gotten responses from them?
Yes, I have. So let me tell you. So in my Senate Bill 21, there's several provisions, what I call my omnibus. Clearly, this Senate Bill 559 deals with additional issues. I wanted to deal with defining a protest. I wanted to mandate body cameras. I wanted to ensure people aren't hogtied and called out of their names. Just some practical things, humane things. But outside of that, I knew in the negotiation process, obviously I'm dealing with a supermajority that is Republican. And I knew very early on, after my bill was heard, that only certain elements would be captured and accepted by the majority, the Republican majority. So I have been sitting down, I sat down with Isom before he left. I sat down with Brett Johnson, and talked to him about my concerns. And literally I have a stack that's this thick right now. I went through items of what I want to see in protocol that's adopted by at least the State Highway Patrol. One of those things, before you even engage St. Louis County, they're the entity that called the Highway Patrol to get involved. And I was tear gassed by the Highway Patrol on August 11th, by my Highway Patrol. Before engagement, the Highway Patrol has to have some kind of communication to assess what is going on the streets before they engage. There are other things that I asked for, like when do you collect tear gas? I didn't know that our Highway Patrol has tear gas, and then after it was used, they resupplied it. That's not shown in the budget. I want to know things like that. And there are other policies that are put into place that I've asked about, and I'm reviewing right now. I got that big list of things yesterday, and so I have to go through it now. But I have had those conversations. At bare minimum, I don't want the state to engage in just uncalled for behavior such as what Ferguson did. I just think it's unacceptable, and that's why they're an embarrassment today to the entire nation. Ferguson is an embarrassment.
Maria, where does this 559 stand?
Well, hopefully it will be heard because it has a lot of policing language in it. It is probably going to come to the Transportation Committee, just like my Senate Bill 21 did. I would hope something like this would be before the Judiciary Committee. There's been a lot of go-between between the two committee chairs, and all three of us have had multiple conversations. My hope is that this is heard and taken seriously, because here's the deal. Here's what I told Senator Sylvie just last night. What happens in Ferguson is what happens to the entire state. If you want the Ferguson to continue to be an embarrassment, that means that the entire state, it continues to be an embarrassment. We have lost a number of international students that go to our higher education institutions in St. Louis University, Washington University, which is in my district, UMSL, which is in my district. They have lost a double-digit numbers of international students. We have also lost a lot of revenue because of Ferguson. If we allow this embarrassment to continue without making substantive changes at the state level, then we are going to be compromising our growth as a state. What happens to Ferguson happens to the entire state, and my colleagues must understand, if this happens again, to the same degree, to the same level, we don't have control. None of us have control of the situation and what happens on the ground, because people are going to be angry. The other thing, it is not addressed, but I talk about this all the time, so please give me leeway. It's not in this bill, but it's in my 21. You have to have counselors. What these people went through, what my constituents went through, was a complete injury to them. And what we are trying to do, and really, what we're trying to do is to fill in the voids, to fill in the gaps where certain rights were taken away. So the First Amendment right was taken away, not only on behalf of the right to assemble peacefully. I mean, I have video of the night on August 11th where people weren't doing anything whatsoever. And they were freaking tear gas. We were all I got my gas mask on my desk upstairs. If you want to go see it, take a picture of it. I have my gas mask upstairs. But what happened to these people over and over, systematically being stopped, being targeted, maybe having dreadlocks, maybe being a little bit ungroomed, maybe having your pants down past what they need to be. Multiple things that define a culture of people. It's not bad that it's not their fault that they're undereducated. It's not their fault that they may be a little bit differently groomed. It's not their fault that they have dreadlocks or wearing an afro like I am. But police officers are looking at the people that I represent as strangers. They're looking at them as insurgents. They're looking at them as if they are illegal aliens. And let me just tell you, there is no difference. And let me be clear, there's a law student, second L at WashU, who said this, who wrote about this. There is no difference between the way Ferguson people have been treated, and they're all legal citizens, and the way people at the border, the Mexican border, have been treated when it comes to excessive militarization. There's absolutely no difference. The difference in all of this is one party are legal citizens, the other party is not. But the way that they are treated by the military is no difference. Is no difference.
So you guys, we have to wrap up because we only have the room till 11:30, so that'll be the last question. If you have any other questions afterwards, please just catch one of us in the hallway. Thanks.